Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today, we'll be talking about the first written framework of government to govern the United States. Now, when independence from Britain was declared, the United States was on the way to forming a new country. And the individual states, in many cases, decided they too needed new forms of government. But there was a lot of debate over exactly how to go about this. Many Americans, especially among the leaders of the Revolution, had a number of fears about government power. They worried about having an overly powerful executive. After all, they were rebelling against a king who was a tyrant. But they also feared that if the government listened too much to the common people, it would be unstable and changeable. Governments, they felt, needed to be republican, in the sense that they would be a thing of the people. Power would be derived from the people to give them their legitimacy, but for the people to properly grant authority, and certainly for leaders to exercise authority, they must be virtuous. Now, virtue as meant in political thought of the late 1700s didn't necessarily refer to sort of personal moral goodness, although that was certainly ideal. Rather, it meant making decisions for the good of the whole. Disinterested decisions, not uninterested, certainly, but disinterested, not influenced by one's personal gain. And furthermore, virtue depended on independence, financial independence and social independence, along with political independence, so that a virtuous republican could not be influenced by a master, and by an employer, by a landlord, or someone like that. A truly virtuous republican made his own way in the world. Indeed, there were many republican thinkers who felt that if you were not working for your own living on your own farm, you didn't really support yourself, that landlords and merchants and bankers were also living off the work of others. Although this idea was often put forward by slave owners who also lived off the work of others, if in a different way. And so, in most states, it was still felt that owning enough land to support one's family was a requirement to be truly independent, and thus truly virtuous. Also, maintaining a good family was seen as part of a republican virtue, and the idea of republican motherhood arose, in some ways developing from the old Puritan notion that a mother ought to be a good Christian to raise her children to be good Christians. Now, in a republic, mothers were seen as sort of the moral guardians of republican virtue, raising their children to be good citizens of a republic. And so, as they created new state constitutions, Americans kept all these concerns and more in mind. And they did all create new state constitutions quite soon, with the exceptions of two states, Rhode Island, who had been effectively self-governing since the beginning, even once they got a royal charter, and Connecticut, whose fundamental orders of Connecticut had also made them effectively self-governing, and even once they technically became a royal colony. And these were all written constitutions, in contrast to the British Constitution, which was kind of the unspoken collection of traditions, legal decisions, and laws dating back to time immemorial. All these state constitutions had a relatively weak executive. It varied a bit from state to state, but they didn't want their governor, or as some called him, their president, to be too powerful. Although, there was one exception, Pennsylvania had no executive at all. And they all had property qualifications to vote, so no one could vote without being influenced by somebody. They all had bicameral legislatures, just as Parliament had the House of Lords and the House of Commons, except in Pennsylvania, where they had a unicameral legislature, and in Georgia, which also had a unicameral legislature. And as I carelessly said earlier, I'm getting ahead of myself, every state had property qualifications to vote, except in Pennsylvania, although even there you had to pay taxes to vote, recognizing, though, that some people might be independently wealthy or at least financially stable if they were a craftsman or a professional, but didn't own land outside of town. So they did not judge wealth necessarily by acreage. In Pennsylvania, there were no property qualifications in terms of land to vote. Furthermore, the idea developed in the 1770s and early 1780s that constitutions, being instruments of the will of the people, ought to be ratified by special conventions chosen by the people for that purpose. How can an existing government on its own create the government that will supersede it? The governments must be created by the people, or rather, their elected representatives. And again, this was done in most states by the end of 1776. And within 6 months of declaring independence, 10 states had new constitutions, and 11th followed not long afterwards. Only Rhode Island and Georgia, Rhode Island and Connecticut holding out. But unfortunately, a lot of these new state constitutions did not work out that well. And with a weak executive, governors could not act very easily in times of emergency. Furthermore, there were annual elections. It was felt that having an election every year kept legislators accountable to the people, but these were often chaotic. It kept politicians frequently campaigning, and there was a lot of turnover, so politicians didn't get much experience in actually running the government. But this took place in every colony or every state except for South Carolina. So annual elections, kept people accountable, or that was the idea, but they were also often chaotic and unstable. And it was even worse in Pennsylvania, where it could take up to 2 years to pass a law, according to the Constitution, because once a bill was passed by the current legislature, an election had to take place before the bill could actually become a law, so that the people could consider how their legislators had voted when deciding how they should vote, if they would re-elect the men who created that law or not. And if they chose not to re-elect them, of course, the incoming legislature could nullify those unpopular laws. And so in the 1780s, most states began to amend or replace their constitutions with more pragmatic, conservative systems. Still, many of these new governments made real efforts to live up to the ideals of the Revolution, not just in weakening the executive and giving more power to the people, but in other ways, replacing old sources of authority. The Church of England lost its established status in the many states where it was the official tax-supported church. Although in some places, taxes did continue to support some churches, as late as 1833, when Massachusetts became the last state to end tax-supported churches. The Congregationalist Church having been supported by taxes up till that point, as it had been since 1630. One of the leaders in this disestablishment movement was Thomas Jefferson, and also his close ally, James Madison. In Virginia, Jefferson wrote the Statute of Religious Liberty, passed in 1786, a document so important, particularly in Jefferson's point of view, that when he designed his own tombstone sometime before his death, this was among the 3 things he chose to put on it. In his view, the 3 greatest things he had done in his life were write the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, and found the University of Virginia. He had not mentioned being president, vice president, or secretary of state, or governor of Virginia on his tombstone. Now, there were those who were unhappy with this decision. Patrick Henry, for example, opposed this Statute of Religious Liberty, fearing it would endanger America's character to disestablish a Christian church. Still, disestablishment was easier than it would have been in earlier generations, because a number of the founding fathers, not all, but many, were influenced to a greater or lesser extent by the Enlightenment idea of deism. Now, deists believed that God existed, but having created the world and created natural laws to govern it, he stepped back and did not take an active role in day-to-day life. He was described sometimes as God the clockmaker. He built the clock, he wound it up, and he let it go. And so, divine intervention, miracles, were not really something one could expect or discern throughout history. So Diaz believed that men still had moral duties to God, but many other parts of traditional religious practice and thought, perhaps even the role of Jesus Christ as the Savior of mankind, because his resurrection is kind of the biggest miracle in history. Things like that were merely superstition. So most of the founding fathers were officially members of one church or another, but there were quite a few, particularly Jefferson, who saw the church as outdated, certainly not the center of life, as had been the case in the past. Furthermore, every state but two passed laws against importing slaves from overseas. The two states who chose to continue importing slaves were Georgia and South Carolina, both of which depended very heavily on slave labor. Georgia in particular was still in the process of building up its population, both free and enslaved. But, as Thomas Jefferson would later put it, slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. Americans didn't like it, but we didn't dare let it go. To do so would be economically disastrous and might lead to a rebellion, as these newly freed slaves would be a huge underclass of unpropertied freemen, a dangerous element in society. And of course, an attempt to end slavery nationwide might provoke disunion. Now, as the various states formed constitutions, the United States as a whole struggled to create a government of their own to carry out the Revolutionary War more fully. Still, shortly after independence was declared in 1776, members of Congress began to create the Articles of Confederation, completing the document in 1777. This created a loose government for the United States. Each state could send as many delegates as they wished to Congress, but each state only got one vote each, just as had been the case in the Second Continental Congress. There was no real executive. There was a president of Congress, but he was more of a chairman, assisted by an executive committee of 13 men, one from each state. And overall, the office was a very weak one. And so sometimes people try to be cute and say the first president of the United States was not George Washington, but the first president of the Confederation Congress, or looking back, one of the Continental Congresses. But that's pretty disingenuous. These were not executive presidents as we think of them today. The Confederation also had no real courts, although Congress did have the right to judge a very few areas, mainly border disputes between states. So essentially a single branch of government in a single body, one house of Congress with all states equal. And it was not easy to pass a law. Most laws required not just a majority, but a 2/3 majority. So 9 states would have to support most laws to pass them, which was often hard to get. And to amend the Articles required a unanimous vote. Indeed, even ratifying the Articles of Confederation required a unanimous vote, which put it off quite a bit. So the Articles of Confederation were designed to be a fairly weak government, to avoid having a strong executive. Those seemed like the kind of things the states were fighting against in the Revolutionary War. Plus, each state viewed itself as sovereign, as independent and self-governing. And so wanted the Articles of Confederation to be a loose union of cooperating, but still basically independent states, perhaps something like the modern European Union. And they discussed this for years, as some states held out for one reason or another. Finally, when the big eastern states agreed to give up their western land claims to Congress's control, that finally satisfied Maryland, the last state holding out, and they signed the Articles of Confederation in 1781, at last putting it into force for the United States of America. And there were several weaknesses. Congress had the power to request money from the states, but could not enforce its demands. So it did not exactly have a taxing power, although Congress could borrow money from any source that would lend it. Congress could print money. They could print paper money, they could mint silver coins, but there wasn't much silver to go around, so they printed so much paper money that the continental dollar lost almost all its value. Not worth a continental became slang for something that was worthless. And furthermore, many states issued their own paper money, often in the same inflationary spiral, printing so much that it lost its value. And so trade between states was challenging because you might have to change your money when crossing state lines. And in addition, many states set tariffs on imports and exports, so you might have to pay tariffs when crossing from, say, North Carolina to Virginia. And they each set separate tariffs with foreign countries, some setting high tariffs to protect their economy, others setting low tariffs to promote trade. There were even trade wars between various states. But in general, this stifled domestic trade within the United States. And so, pretty soon, foreign merchants didn't want to do business with America. No one trusted the United States as a trading partner, especially with the knowledge that debts might be paid off with devalued paper money or not paid off at all. Virginia, in particular, resisted repaying pre-war debts by large planters to British merchants. Congress could also conduct warfare and diplomacy, and here again they were, with of course a couple of exceptions, not very successful. Of course, Congress did negotiate the Peace of Paris, or Treaty of Paris, ending the American Revolutionary War, but Britain did not follow some of the important parts of the treaty. For example, Britain retained a number of forts in the Northwest, north of the Ohio River and around the Great Lakes. They also refused to pay for slaves released by Lord Dunmore or other royal officials. So British troops were still on American territory after the war. Of course, America did not, for the most part, repay loyalists who had lost their property, as the treaty had required. Furthermore, the United States and Britain disputed their northern boundary. Precisely where the boundary between the U.S. and Canada would not be really settled till the 1840s. Furthermore, Britain began to close off trade to America, partly in spite to weaken this new country that had just won its independence. But trade was important. Also, trade was important on the Mississippi River, but Spain, which controlled the western bank of the Mississippi and the port city of New Orleans as mouth, closed off American trade also to try to limit this growing republic. Now, John Jay of New York tried to make a treaty with Spain that would have opened up Spain and Spain's Caribbean and Central and South American colonies to American trade, but this would have accepted Spain's closure of the Mississippi River. And this was viewed as a betrayal by many Westerners for whom the Mississippi River was their most important trade route. The Appalachian Mountains were so hard to cross with the terrible roads at the time that for many people producing various goods, especially trapping furs west of the Appalachians, it was easier to load up your goods on a flatboat, float down the local river till you eventually reach the Mississippi, sail to New Orleans, sell your cargo there, bust up your boat and sell it for firewood, and then jog back home. That was viewed as better than trying to cross the Appalachian Mountains. Accepting Spain's closure of the Mississippi was seen as a betrayal of Westerners, although some Easterners were perfectly happy to see Western settlement limited, as they feared that Western settlement that was too extensive might eventually lead to Western attempts at independence. But Congress did make some very important provisions for settling the West. Indeed, among the few really lasting and significant acts of Congress were the passage of the Land Ordinance in 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. The Land Ordinance of 1785 set aside orderly rules for surveying and selling land in the Northwest in neat square townships and sections, including a provision that 1 out of every 16 sections of land in a township, number 16 specifically, would be sold to raise money for a school in that township, U.S. government's first attempt to promote public education. The Northwest Ordinance went much further, among other things describing how to create new states, up to 5 new states in the Northwest Territory, describing how Congress would appoint governors to these states, or these territories, as the Northwest Territory was broken up, once the population of a territory exceeded 60,000 people, which at the time would have made it slightly more populous than our least populous states. They could then apply to Congress for admission as states, and once accepted, they would become fully equal states, equal to all the existing states, not provinces or colonies or some inferior territory. Furthermore, in these new states, slavery was forbidden. There were a few loopholes in that, so there were some slaves in this area up till the time of the Civil War, but very few. And this was the first time the U.S. government tried to regulate and to limit the expansion of slavery. This would be viewed as a great legacy of the Northwest Ordinance by many people, although eventually offensive to some Southerners, including those on the Supreme Court in the late 1850s. Now, the Southwest did not get such well-detailed plans, in part because while Virginia and other states claiming land north of the Ohio River had given that land up, Virginia was unwilling to give up the District of Kentucky, despite the fact that there were people there seeking to become their own states. And likewise, North Carolina had trouble with their western territory as well. Now in 1784, North Carolina, like other states, offered to cede its western land to Congress, but Congress did not immediately vote to accept this cession or to reject it. North Carolina did hope to get some relief for its share of the war debt in exchange for giving up its western land. But when North Carolina's delegates in Congress heard that North Carolina had given up their land, really without many strings attached, they wrote back home and said, "Are you all stupid?" The New England states, when they gave up their western land claims, got much more credit against their war debt, despite giving up much less land. And so, Congress not yet having voted on accepting the cession, North Carolina voted to take back their offer to cede this land. But in the meantime, there were several months in which there was arguably no government for western North Carolina. North Carolina had given it up, but Congress had not yet taken it in. And so the people there, as Americans will do if they have no government, formed one of their own, creating what they called the state of Franklin in what's now Upper East Tennessee. Then once North Carolina tried to reclaim this territory, the two struggled for control of the region for 4 years before Franklin finally collapsed. But for 4 years, Franklin did exist sort of as an independent state, with John Sevier as its first governor and William Koch as sort of an unofficial delegate to Congress, lobbying for Franklin's admission as a state. A majority of states were willing to accept Franklin as a state, but not a large enough majority, not a 2/3 majority. It was particularly opposed by North Carolina, of course, but also by some other states where there was regions still trying to get their independence. Virginia did not want to set an example for Kentucky to gain independence. Massachusetts did not want to set an example for Maine. Although Georgia, which still had large western land claims, supported Franklin, hoping to work with Franklin to seize land from the Creek Indians in the Great Bend of the Tennessee River, more or less northern Alabama on today's maps. So again, the state of Franklin suffered from internal disputes for the 4 years or so of its existence. And if you'd like to learn more, I'll post a link up there here in just a moment for you to check on. But the fact that Congress could not settle this, and it finally came to an end with a battle in the state of Franklin between supporters of Franklin, supporters of North Carolina, showed that Congress could not resolve this major internal dispute, nor other internal disputes that verged on civil war. Furthermore, even after the Northwest Ordinance was passed, much of that land was claimed by American Indians and occupied it. And most were willing to fight for it, although some leaders did agree to give up some claims to their land, but most did not. So in 1785, a number of western tribes, some of the Iroquois, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Ottawa, the Chippewa, and others, confederated together for mutual defense and sometimes coordinated attacks on white settlements. This is sometimes called the Western Indian Confederation, which is often the preferred term today, or the Miami Confederation, the more common term then. The Miami were believed to be the main tribe involved in this. All the Shawnee were also very important. And this confederation would pose a serious threat to American settlement. And Americans were in danger on the high seas, as the U.S. Navy had been disbanded after the Revolutionary War, so there was no protection for American merchant vessels from the Barbary Pirates, based in North Africa, who raided trade in the Mediterranean and even the Eastern Atlantic. And so American ships were exposed to capture and to the enslavement of their crews. The British and the French also occasionally preyed on American shipping. And even in safely settled areas, America was beset by problems. Congress were deep in debt, owing money to foreigners and to American merchants, which had funded the Revolution and other things as well. But because they couldn't raise taxes, they really couldn't do anything about it. And Congress could request money from the states and got some, but only a fraction of what they needed. And the $50 million the national government owed seemed impossible to service. Many states had high debts as well. Personal debt was also a problem for many Americans. For one thing, right after the Revolutionary War ended, Americans had celebrated by spending lots of money on foreign goods, creating a trade deficit of about 5 million pounds, or about $20 million. And under the system of mercantilism, this created a dangerous outflow of hard currency, of specie, as it was known, which left America very cash poor. And while times had seemed good at first, in fact, America entered a small depression, a recession, I guess would be a better term. And the lack of specie made it hard for people to pay back their loans, hurting creditors. And even Congress could not pay back their debts, either to continental soldiers, American creditors, or foreign governments. And because Congress couldn't really tax the states, but just request contributions, they only got about 1/6 of what they believed they needed. And the United States were in danger of defaulting on their loans. But a group of nationalists emerged who want a stronger government who could deal with all these problems. These nationalists included Robert Morris, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And among other things, they proposed the Continental Impost, a 5% tariff on imported goods to be collected by and go to the general government. In 1781, every state but one, Rhode Island, voted in favor of this impost. But because it took a unanimous agreement to amend the Articles, the motion failed in 1781 and failed again when they tried once more in 1783. The states, likewise, tried to raise money by raising taxes, especially around 1785 to 86, but many farmers were outraged, especially in New England, where there was perhaps the most diversity in economic interests, having significant farming interests in rural areas, but significant commercial interests in their port cities. So many farmers resented this attempt to collect taxes, but people who held bonds and wanted to be paid back strongly approved of it, in creating kind of a coastal versus rural division. Many banks called in their loans, requiring people to pay them in full, including the Bank of North America, the Bank of New York, and the Bank of Massachusetts. When debtors, mostly farmers, could not pay, their property was seized. To many, this felt like the kind of economic tyranny they had fought a war to escape. So by 1786, many men, especially Western farmers, were desperate. They could not pay off their personal debts nor pay their state taxes. In Rhode Island, farmers used the vote to take charge of the state assembly through the electoral process and began a program of farm relief that scared everybody else. Particularly, they printed what was known as rag money, paper being made in part from old rags. And as paper money was printed in such quantities, it was practically worthless, and yet by law, it had to be accepted at face value. So many creditors felt cheated, defrauded of loans they had made in good faith. And the fight between rural and urban people in Rhode Island would go on for decades, if not typically as dramatically as it was in the 1780s. Things were also bad in Massachusetts, which was controlled by its eastern merchants and commercial interests, but of course also had a large rural population, and which also was deep in debt, and mostly to rich American merchants who had lent this money to the state during the war. And these men started to call in their loans. So to raise money, Massachusetts passed a very heavy direct tax, which had to be paid in specie, just as the British had done 20 years before. And in western parts of the states, poor farmers had trouble paying the tax. Paying it at all would have been a problem, but especially paying in gold or silver, which was very scarce, was especially hard. Farms and other property were seized, and farmers got angry. By 1786, 1/3 of Massachusetts farmers were being sued for debts. The jails were filling up with men, many of whom were considered respectable members of their community, many of them Revolutionary War veterans. One respected farmer and veteran was Daniel Shays, and he decided something had to be done to protect the liberty and property of the people of Massachusetts. And he organized resistance to the state government, which would be known as Shays' Rebellion. Shays and his followers made several demands of the state legislature: printing paper money to increase the money supply and promote inflation, both of which would make it easier to pay off debts. They wanted tax relief, a moratorium on debts. People would still have to pay their debts back, but not right now. They also want to move the state capital from Boston to somewhere in the interior of the state to make it closer to everyone, or at least most people, and hopefully free it from the corrupt mercantile interests of the big city. And many states did do such things. South Carolina moved their capital from Charlestown to Columbia, Virginia from Richmond to Williamsburg, Pennsylvania from Philadelphia to Harrisburg. North Carolina eventually moved their state capital. And for a while, their state capital would deliberately alternate every couple years between a coastal and a slightly interior location. But Massachusetts, by the way, never did this. Their capital is still Boston. They also wanted to end the imprisonment for debt. So by the summer of 1786, armed bands, many of their members Revolutionary War veterans, prevented the collection of debts. They prevented the sale of property. Property that was seized for non-payment of taxes was typically auctioned off on the steps of the county courthouse once a month. But if you blocked the courthouse or beat up the sheriff or scared him off, property couldn't be auctioned off. The East was frightened. Even Samuel Adams, who had promoted resistance 20, even 10 years ago, called Shays' men rebels and traitors now that he was governor of Massachusetts. And so in January of 1787, state militiamen from eastern Massachusetts, funded through loans from wealthy businessmen, marched west, attacked Shays' men at Springfield, killing 3, wounding 1, and capturing many more, including Shays. He and his men were sentenced to death, but were later pardoned and some of their demands granted, such as a reduction in taxes and the postponement of debt payments. But still, this rebellion frightened many Americans. Many of the more influential feared that similar rebellions might break out around the country. It also showed that the existing government structure was fiscally and militarily troubled, incompetent. Some described it as imbecile, incapable of action. And therefore, more people began sympathetic to the nationalists. And so, even though Shays' rebellion was defeated, and some states, mostly in the South, although not only, or everywhere in the South either, did have sound currencies and responsible finances, the danger of Shays' rebellion, frontier state movements, Indian warfare, international problems, and a general imbecility of the general government led some men to attempt to reform, or possibly, though they said it only in whispers, to replace the Articles of Confederation.